그럼 지금부터 6-1
Now we'd like to begin session 6-1 under the topic of the internal and external policies of the Kim Jong-un regime and its future strategies. We will listen to presentations as well as comments from the discussants. The moderator of this session is Mr. Kim Jong-un, Director of Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University. With that, I would like to hand the floor over to him.
네, 안녕하세요.
Hello.
김정은 체제의
So the topic of this session is the internal and external policies of the Kim Jong-un regime and its future strategies. As introduced, my name is Kim Byung-eun. I'm the Director of Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at the Seoul National University. I'm the moderator of this session. We have a very important topic to discuss, and I'm sure that the participants of this session will give us some interesting viewpoints and fresh insights with regards to this issue. We will listen to 3 presentations first. Each presenter has about 15 minutes to present. After the 3 presentations are over, I will introduce the 3 discussants and listen to their remarks. After that, if time allows, we will take questions from the floor or from our online viewers. I would like to introduce the 3 presenters first. To my left is Mr. Kim Ji-hoon, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University. Dr. Kim Ji-hoon majored in politics and philosophy. And did you also major in not only philosophy and politics, but also physiology? Okay, I see. And next to him is Mr. Kim Hak-jae, Assistant Professor at the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University. He majored in North Korean society affairs. And he is a seasoned scholar in the field of North Korea, and I'm sure that he will be able to share with us his valuable insights. And he applies the outcomes of his analysis with regards to North Korea's nuclear matters, so I'm sure that his presentation will be very interesting. And next to him is Mr. Kim Taek-bin, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University. It has not yet been a year since Dr. Kim Taek-bin received his doctoral degree, and he received his PhD in politics, and I'm sure that his presentation will give us a greater insight into North Korean politics. Now, without further ado, we would like to begin the presentations. As I told you before, you have 15 minutes each. Hello, as introduced, my name is Kim Ji-hoon from the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies. So the title of my presentation is The Nuclear Weapons Strategy of the Kim Jong-un Regime from the Lenses of the Concept of Recognition. Now, the nuclear weapons strategies and also possible nuclear test of the Kim Jong-un regime have never been approached from the concept of recognition. But there is that famous German philosopher Hegel, which mentioned the concept of recognition. And when we apply that to North Korean affairs, we might be able to get some new insights into the regime. So Kim Jong-un is faced with a dilemma today. At a time when economic sanctions are ongoing, the Kim Jong-un regime has continued with nuclear tests. And it uses its nuclear development program so as to legitimize his leadership. Potential nuclear tests are the focus of the international community today, and Minister Blinken did say that the U.S. assesses that North Korea is preparing for a seventh nuclear test.
질문과 배경을 간단하게 설명드리고
Now allow me to give you my research questions as well as the background.
최근 신정부가 들어선 이후에 대외
After the new administration came into South Korea, one of the frequently raised questions is that will North Korea conduct a seventh nuclear test, and if so,
어떠한 방식으로
when
할지에 대한
and how?
논의라고 볼 수 있을 것 같습니다. 이러한 논의 속에서 저는 북한과 김정은 체제에게 과연 핵이라는 문제 또
With that
핵실험이라고
question
하는 핵
in
자체가
mind,
어떤
what does
의미인지에 대한
nuclear weapons and what does a nuclear test mean to North Korea and the Kim Jong-un regime? I'd like to address this question.
소위 합리적 행위자 모델로
Now,
보았을
when we
때
talk about the model of a rational
거의
actor,
제2차 고난의 행군이라고 일컬어지는 시기 속에서
at a time when
북한이
North
할수
Korea
있는
is
합리적의 행동이라고
figuratively
하는 것은
facing a second arduous march, the rational step for North Korea is to give up its nuclear program and become a normal state.
이러한 선택을 북한이 택하지 않을 것이라는
But
것이 저희는 거의 확실하게 받아들이고
we are almost confident that North Korea will not take that track,
유언할 것이라고 얘기되고
and that North Korea, the possibility of North Korea renouncing its nuclear program remains distant.
이러한 환경 내에서 과연 북한은 제7차 핵실험을 개진할 것인가?
Then amid these circumstances, will North Korea truly conduct a seventh nuclear
같은
test?
행동을 보여줄 것인가? 즉
Will North Korea show consistency in its attitude towards a seventh nuclear test
다른 미사일 실험 등을 통해서 위협을
and also conducting missile tests so as to increase tensions in Northeast Asia when a new administration has come into power in South Korea? To address these questions, we would have to explore which of the various policy directions the Kim Jong-un regime has in mind are prioritized.
검토되어야 되는 필요가 있다고 생각을 합니다. 일반적으로 핵무기, 북한의 핵무장 동기 여부를 떠나서 일반적으로 핵무장을 왜 하는가?
Regardless of North Korea's motivation for being armed with nuclear weapons, let's talk about nukes in general, a state's possession of nukes. The Joseph, a Syrian CEO, mentioned these three elements: security, prestige, domestic politics, and another thing, fourth thing, technology, to explain why a state would possess nukes. He explains that there are interests of certain forces that protect sovereignty, promote the image of a powerful state, and claim nuclear armament. And countries with related technologies. When these four elements are satisfied, a state is willing to arm itself with nuclear weapons. And among these four elements, the two last elements pertain to North Korea. To legitimize his leadership, Kim Jong-un seeks to develop nuclear weapons, and plus, its related technology capabilities have advanced throughout the years. Then with regards to the first two elements, what among those two pertain to North Korea? Is it about protecting its sovereignty or to promote the image of a powerful nation? We would need further discussions on that. So, Article 2 of North Korea's Nuclear Possession Act in 2013 says that the nuclear power serves to curb and repel aggression against the source of aggression. And how can we discourage North Korea from developing nuclear weapons? I think we have a very simple answer, a simple logic to that. Anyone with security in mind would be able to reach this conclusion. North Korea's nuclear development is to secure its national security and also nuclear deterrence. capability. Then, to change the status quo,
수단으로 하여서 타 국가 혹은 지역 내 질서권 내에서
North Korea
좀 공고하게 할 수 있는
seeks to concretize its national status in the global arena. That if that can be satisfied, then we might be able to
모두 아시다시피 이렇게
discourage North Korea from developing nuclear weapons. But the matter is not as easy as it sounds, and I will tell you why later.
북한이 왜 이렇게 핵무기를 계속해서 염두에 두고 있느냐를 두고 기존 연구에서는
And North Korea is obsessed with its nuclear program, which can be explained from two aspects, from domestic aspect and international aspect. So, domestically speaking, he wants to legitimize his regime and his authority, and to outside world, given the current political order, North Korea's national prestige is so low that it wants to bring that up so as to secure the level of security that it wants for its regime.
첫 번째 그 말씀드렸던 국내 정치적 차원이 북한의 핵무기
Now,
상태를
internal political affairs was one of the motivating factors, or we raised the question whether internal political affairs was one of the motivating factors behind North Korea's nuclear development program. And we conducted a survey based on interviews with North Korean defectors, 1,241 defectors. And these defectors say that the reason why North Korea suffered from economic recessions is because not of the wrong judgments that the North Korean leadership made or this lack of capability, but it is because of excessive military expenditure.
그럼에도 불구하고 정권 정당화를 위해서 북한이 핵 개발을 한다라는 논리로 설명하기에는 어려움이
But this is still not enough to persuade us into believing that North Korea is pursuing nuclear development program to secure the regime's security. Now, once again, we do agree that North Korea's economic recession is largely due to excessive military spending, but whether and the North Korean defectors actually say that they see a decreasing number of people who actually endorse the idea of nuclear weapons, and that many people are taking a lukewarm stance towards the regime's possession of nuclear weapons. So, internal political affairs of North Korea cannot be a trigger for North Korea's possession of nukes. Then perhaps we could think about another element, which is that through nukes, North Korea is seeking to raise its national prestige internationally. So going beyond the security purposes, North Korea wishes to become a nuclear-armed state, to become a global powerhouse. Perhaps that's the reason behind its nuclear development program. But as you can see in North Korea's constitution, what North Korea explicitly say, or to all outward appearances, it appears that North Korea's nuclear power serves its security purposes. So perhaps the argument that North Korea is developing nukes to raise its international prestige might be too far-fetched. Then perhaps it might be related to gaining recognition, but recognition by whom, from whom? So when we look at the distinct characteristics of North Korea, perhaps we need to approach this from the viewpoint that this North Korea is actually struggling for recognition at an individual and at a state level. Now, the concept of recognition in international politics is about a state differentiating itself from other states, becoming aware of its identity, and is positively evaluated from other states so as to form an intersubjective significance for its identity. Now, when unrecognized, restrictions are imposed in the areas of security, and that would also lead to limitations in economic assistance or benefits that it can gain from cultural exchange, that the state ultimately fails to meet internal social needs, which is the case of North Korea today. So in order for a state to maintain its presence and capability and capacity, it is important that its identity becomes recognized by other states. Then, North Korea's struggle for recognition, if that indeed is the case, then who is it targeting? If we look at what the Central TV of North Korea has broadcasted, many of the words or many of its rhetorics criticize the United States. In fact, the ratio of its criticism against the United States took up 3.3% in 2015. That was the highest ratio, but on average, that was the lowest ratio, I'm sorry, but on average, the criticism against the United States account for 64.9% of its rhetorics made on the Central TV. And the United States did not have any nuclear threats in its policy towards North Korea. And so you might be puzzled why North Korea is still trying to target the United States in terms of its struggle for recognition. And with regards to whether nuclear threat equals to nuclear possessions, Scott D. Sagan actually criticizes this idea, and that you must review domestic politics and international norms in addition to security factors. Now, exploring these different elements can certainly be helpful, but how can we really resolve North Korea's nuclear issue? When it comes to that question, exploring these elements still may pose some complexity. So let's take a look at the concept of recognition by Hegel, so as to explain the motivation behind North Korea's nuclear development. I could tell you many things, but because I'm crunched on time, I will be very short. So Hegel argues that a country does not gain recognition from another country just because it has sovereign independence. So ensuring equality between countries is important, but not only formal equality, but content equality. Whether the two countries are able to sit down together and actually engage in conversation at an equal footing is important. And if you want to gain prestige in the international politics, the actor must be equipped with necessary capabilities that befits that status and needs to be given the privilege or rights that is recognized, which enables that state to have its national prestige recognized by other states. And in a situation like this,
북한이 여전히 대화 상대자 또 자신의 국가의 지위를 인정받고자 노력하고 있는 대상.
North Korea is trying to gain the recognition of the United States. In other words, the target of North Korea's struggle for recognition is limited to the United States. So that's a big question that we must address going forward when dealing with North Korea's nuclear issues. Now, I'd like to go over the discussions of not only Hegel, but also Thucydides, so as to address North Korea's nuclear issues. And then with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Now, Hegel said that So civil society faces a situation in which it can no longer become complacent by its internal
개인이
logic.
혼자 살아가는 것 자체에 한계가 있기 때문에
So there are limitations
온전한 국가 역할을
with an
하기
individual
위해서는
living alone. So for a state to function normally, you cannot just stay or be complacent by your internal logic.
생존과 관련해서 좀 더 확장해
So you must take an expanded view,
내에서의 이익만 챙기는 것이 아니라 타 국가와
and you should not only pursue your own interests, but
보편 정신이나 세계 정신의 출현을
you must
받아들여야 됨을
embrace the emergence of a what Hegel calls a universal spirit or world spirit that pursues the benefits of the larger society or the larger community.
즉각적인 해결을 강화하는 것이 아니라
So
북한이 바라고 있는 중장기적인 이익은 어떻게
rather than looking at immediate effect, we would have to take a look at what North Korea's midterm interests are, not short-term interests. And another philosopher that is referred to often when it comes to North Korean issue is Thucydides. And he said that Athens and Sparta were ignorant of each other and there was no effort to get to know each other, and hence they engaged in a war. Now, the Kim Jong-un regime, despite its many difficulties, continues to pursue nuclear development program, and we have to think about this issue. I'm sorry. And this has to be communicated consistently between the US and South Korea governments. And the basis of trust that constantly afflicts North Korea-US relations and inter-Korean relations is key. By sharing our knowledge and understanding about this trust, and by becoming alarmed to the hubris that we had before, that we understand North Korea well, is something that we must bear in mind as we go forward with North Korean nuclear issue.
Next, Professor Kim Hak-jae.
안녕하세요. 두 번째 발표를 맡은 서울대학교 통일평화연구원.
Hello, I am Kim Hak-jae from Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University. I would like to give a presentation focusing on three pillars. That is the conditions for denuclearization, second, the most optimum solution, and three is the sustainability of denuclearization talks. As said, these are the contents of my presentation. There will be two important matters related with conditions. In order for denuclearization to happen, the international political conditions need to be also favorable. But with the US-China conflicts and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we're seeing an emergence of more crises. We have to understand why these crises occur. And on the Korean Peninsula, or surrounding the Korean Peninsula, there is a rising tensions regarding the deterrence. So what kind of conditions need to be met so that we can not only have a balance of deterrence, but move towards denuclearization and disarmament negotiations? And there are lots of options that were presented to the table until now. So what should be considered as the most optimum one? And last but not least, if negotiations kick off, how can these negotiations be sustainable? Everybody is aware that negotiations are difficult in terms of denuclearization, but I think that a lot of people are also aware of some very good and possible options. But what is challenging is that we have to first meet the conditions to initiate denuclearization negotiations, and even though the negotiations kick off, they rarely remain durable. So how can we have a better understanding of these matters is the gist or the core of my presentation.
So there are lots of text on my slide here, but there is an increasing tension among different countries nowadays, and it is because for the past 30 years, the trend for globalization has aggravated inequality among different countries. So there is a growing emergence of the right-wing populism and increasing nationalism. And added to that, COVID-19 broke out in 2019. And the responses to COVID-19 also varied among different countries. So there was a gap and disparity that appeared between advanced countries, middle countries, and the developing countries. There's also the climate issue. So in assuming the cost for responding to climate issues, there are countries that have the ability to bear the cost, but there are also different types of countries as well. So there are Russia and also Middle East, which are very much resource export oriented countries. There are also very low developed countries. So the perspectives among climate regarding climate issue vary greatly. So in the past, we used to consider globalization and economic integration as something that is positive. But with the aggravating zero-sum awareness, there are intensifying buying competition and tension. So Gallup from 1990s conducted a survey on the image of different countries. And back in the days when there was, after the death of Gorbachev, so the Russia's image after the Cold Era was not that bad. So it was quite favorable. But afterwards, there was the Chechen crisis, Georgia invasion, and especially after the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, Russia's image drastically worsened. So this is not something that dates back to recent years. You can see that the Russia's image has drastically changed over the years. And as for China, in the 70s and 80s, they were very favorable in terms of their image because of détente policy. But for the past 2 to 3 years, China's image or national image has greatly aggravated. And after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the beginning of 2022, actually, this is a Finnish. You can see that the Finnish geopolitical risks have increased after this war. And following the US-China competition, there is also a geopolitical risk increase vis-a-vis Taiwan. So, in implementing policies, a lot of countries are at a crossroad. Are we going to focus more on security, or are we going to focus more on stable relations? So the largest economic blocs in the world, US, China, and EU, they see a great fluctuation or changes in terms of GDP. There was a time when actually Europe's GDP exceeded US, but you can see that it remains stagnant. And from 2010, China's GDP exceeded EU, and you can see that a lot of the Western world tried very hard to keep China in check. So there is a growing opposition or repulsion towards globalization. There is increasing US-China tensions, and we are also seeing increasing number of semiconductor supply disruptions and so forth. A lot of the countries with very much advanced industrial structure, their sustainability index is quite high and their carbon emissions are low. As you can see that the top 10 countries are the largest contributors of carbon emissions, but their SDG ranking is not as good.
22년 러시아의 어떤
So in 2022,
경제적 이해관계라고 할 수 있을 것 같습니다.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine was one of the issue, and also the COVID-19 outbreak. And the economic complexity has also increased with globalization and economic integration. A lot of countries are showing a very high level of economic complexity, but Russia actually saw a decrease in this score, and it is very much dependent on energy and resource export. So that is also resulting in a lot of geopolitical crisis. And Russia is very much keen on addressing those issues. And as you may well know, the energy prices soared recently, food prices went up, leading to increased inflation. And that is putting a lot of burden on energy transition costs. So given all of these facts, I think that we can have a better understanding of the current situation with this table. Recently, there are lots of policies it has been the policies focus to democratize and to construct a nation and ensure security and so forth. And then after 2008, after the financial crisis, it was very difficult for the members of the international community to communicate, to participate in the economic system, international economic system on an equal footing. So that is causing a lot of burden for a lot of countries. So there is the issue of globalization and the climate change issue that still remain unsolved. And it seems like, different camps are continue to be divided, like in the past during the Cold Era. But we should not consider this conflict as just like that. So it is very important that to know that the burden is not the same for all the countries around the world. There are many tasks that need to be addressed to ease global tensions, but I'm going to skip that part. So there are lots of conditions for tensions around the world, and individual countries, rather than making diplomatic efforts to address the situation, they are very keen on building up their military capability or defense capability. And between deterrence and negotiation, we have to make a choice, and sometimes the choice can be different among different countries. So at the table, you can see that there is the high-level nuclear country, low-level nuclear country, and unarmed country or non-nuclear country, and that's at the top. And on the left, you can see there is a high use of conventional weapons and low use of conventional weapons. So there between Russia and EU, between China and India, and between North Korea and Pakistan, the level of nuclear deterrence and the use of conventional weapons is a little bit different. So this diagram actually depicts or explains about the changing patterns of the nuclear doctrine of nuclear powers. So as for the powers equipped with conventional weapons, they use nuclear as a defensive mechanism. But if countries don't have a lot of conventional force or conventional capability, so especially countries with advanced IT and service industry, these countries don't have a high level of conventional capability. So they opt for more sophistication of their nuclear capability. And in that process, nuclear is not only used as something to defend their country, but as an offensive means. And these countries opt for a more flexible approach. Recently, according to the U.S. Nuclear Post Review, U.S. says that they may actually use a low level of nuclear capability. So China has the conventional, but also the U.S. also that has the conventional and the nuclear power. So there is not much tension regarding nuclear between China and U.S. But since Korea is actually weak in conventional and North Korea is stronger in conventional, it is highly likely that North Korea will use nuclear as an offensive means, and that could trigger more crisis. And that is a dilemma that a lot of countries face. So in the short term, the level of deterrence between China and U.S. is not that high. So it is not really likely that they will engage in disarmament negotiations. But if China developed a service industry and also reduces the conventional capability, then as it was the case during the U.S.-Soviet era, there could be a likelihood to sign an agreement, military agreement, to control the use of nuclear. And if you just look at North Korea, it is highly likely that China will not become directly involved in persuading or dissuading North Korea to pursue its nuclear programs. But overall, China, EU, and US are expanding their military expenditure, and if that poses a burden on their economies, and there could be also political factors that come into play, like elections. And in the long run, the U.S. may want to see South Korea to take more initiative on the North Korea issue. And if U.S. believes that will be beneficial for the mid to long-term U.S.-China relations, and then maybe we can opt for negotiations to kick off. So for the time being, status quo and expanding deterrence may seem like the path to take, but at some point, with the increasing military expenditure, that's going to have a negative impact on the economy, and that could pose a burden for the countries. And that may spark the need for negotiations, and once that negotiation is sparked, then that could facilitate to address the North Korean issue. So I'll be very brief with the remaining part of my presentation. I will complement my remarks during the discussions. So a lot has been said about the denuclearization negotiations, and Robert Einhorn at the Brooks Institute actually defined denuclearization as follows. So there are conditions that need to be met. So there are things that should be included in the preliminary agreement, and what will be the level of participation from China and so forth. So what conditions should be met for North Korea to be engaged in negotiation? So actually on the left, bottom right, you see that is North Korea. It's becoming nuclear armed, and it is also pursuing economic development. But if the regional stability increases, then North Korea might go towards the left, upper left, which is initiating denuclearization negotiation. And once the denuclearization negotiations start, sanctions may be eased, and that could also help North Korea to further accelerate its economic development. I will not go deep into all of these now. So these are the details of the approaches that we can take. So if negotiations are possible, and how can we implement sustainability? So in the latter half of this year and first half of next year, there are important events in China and the US. And in November, there will be G20, and also at the end of this year, COP27 and Qatar World Cup in December. So when all of these events take place, we would be able to have a better anticipation of what's going to happen in Northeast Asia, and we could identify or see more positive signals in relations improving. So if that happens, then we can explore the approaches to denuclearization negotiation I talked about. And since the polarization is very also rampant in the United States, and if there is the Republican government, then we believe that the U.S.-China tensions will rise further. And as for Korea, of course, the opposition and the ruling party do have differences, but these differences are not as stark as in the United States. So how we're going to bridge the gap of ideas or views is an essential issue to address. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to move on to the third presenter, Kim Taek-bin.
Hello, my name is Kim Tae-bin. I'm a senior fellow at the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University. So the two presenters talked about North Korea's foreign policy or external policy. But in my presentation, I would like to talk about North Korea's internal policy. I'm especially going to focus on the appointment of elites in the Kim Jong-un era. So what elements actually impact the appointment of elites in North Korea? I did a quantitative analysis and there were some interesting findings, so I'm going to share that with you now. So my presentation consists of these 6 parts.
먼저 이제 서두에서 이 연구의
The biggest finding of this research is that the elites that belong to the party and the military compared to those who belong to the government or external organization have higher probability of being appointed to key posts. And since 2016, the elite structure or the elite appointment structure changes significantly, especially the military elites. So I'm going to focus on that. So Kim Jong-un came to power in 2012, and many experts and media outlets had doubts over the future of the regime because Kim Jong-un was very young, only in his late 20s, and he did not have any political experience. So can this young leader lead North Korea in a stable manner? But it's been 10 years since Kim Jong-un took power, and let's take a look at North Korea now. It's fairly stable. Well, that's the assessment that we can make of North Korea today, but we want to raise one question here. Then, you know that North Korea has a strong Seoul guidance system or Seoul dictatorship, but is there no conflict between the leader and the elites? I would say probably not. So, and I would like to also raise the question, in the process of power succession, did Kim Jong-un really not face any troubles? Those are some of my research questions. So, scholars say that when in a state a long-serving leader dies and when there is a lack of succession plans, that generally involve high levels of uncertainty. So that might have been the case for North Korea as well. Now you see the picture of a swan here, and the swan looks very elegant on the surface, very peaceful and stable, but underneath the water surface, its feet are moving in a very fast manner. It's struggling to stay afloat. That may be the same for North Korea. To all outward appearances, North Korea may appear stable, but if you look inside the regime, there may be a lot of dynamics going on. So this study wants to look into what sort of internal challenges there were in North Korea in terms of Kim Jong-un's secession of power and how Kim Jong-un responded to it. And the study conducted an empirical analysis. I don't think there were ever studies, or there were hardly any studies who did an empirical analysis on North Korea's political pattern based on quantitative data. So I would say that this research could make a significant contribution in this field. Now, North Korea is one of the longest state with dictatorship system in the world. North Korea and China are the only countries with more than 70 years of dictatorship. And there have been many studies about the North Korean regime in the context of comparative communists like Scalapino and Lee. And there are also studies on North Korean leadership with regards to Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, and studies on North Korean ideology and so on. And in the area of comparative politics, there have not been many studies that were conducted. So I took the data set, and the data set categorized North Korea into civil-led single-party dictatorship or dominant single-party regime. But if we break that down into further, we could say that North Korea can be understood under the context of dominant single-party regime or hybrid dominant party and personalist regime. But I believe that these do not reflect the dynamism and the political changes or political volatility that's actually going inside the regime. So to overcome that limitation, I conducted this study. You see a graph on the top right. It's very small, so you probably cannot see the letters. But the tallest stick actually represents coup. So this graph represents regime change. What factor played a key role in regime change when looking at all countries with dictatorship all across the world? So coup was actually the biggest factor that led to a regime collapse. And that may be the same for North Korea as well. No dictator can rule alone. They need elites who support them, who support that dictator. While the elite group is essential for politics, they can also be the most threatening to a dictator. So there is a conflict of interest between the leader and the elites. To prevent the risk of coup, the elite would resort to various measures, and the elites would also make various efforts to not be purged by the leader and to survive. So those are some of the clashing elements between the leader and the elite. To manage the elites, the leader usually uses carrot and stick method. So co-optation and appointment would be carrot, whereas demotion and purge would be the stick. And this research also focuses on the compensation. By compensation, I'm talking about the appointment of elites to key positions. So many scholars in their existing studies focus on the cohesiveness or solidarity of the organization that the elites are affiliated with. So if there is a high group cohesiveness, the elites usually have an advantageous position in terms of power distribution with the leader. They are very cohesive, which means that they can wield power when it comes to negotiating with the leader. But if the elites belong to a group that has low level of cohesiveness, then they would be divided and ruled, and they would be defeated one by one. So maybe we can apply this logic to North Korea. So I have two hypotheses. One hypothesis is that the elites in the party and the military with high solidarity will be more likely to be appointed to key posts than those in government or outside organizations. And second hypothesis is a bit more specific. Since the 7th Congress in 2016, I've looked into what changes there were in the appointment of elites before and after 2016. And I do have the premise that before 2006, Kim Jong-un's rule was rather unstable because he was still trying to concretize his power. But after 2006, after he actually did concretize his power, what happened to the appointment of the elites? So this is the second hypothesis. Since the 7th Congress in 2016, elites belonging to the highly united party and military have been less likely to be appointed to key posts than elites belonging to the government or outside organizations. So I tested these two hypotheses and I used data. So the data is 296 elites who were appointed as members of the Party Central Committee during the Third Party Congress of the 6th Central Committee in 2010. So I looked into their background. So I coded all the data actually, and I created a PANA data, and I adopted a negative binomial regression model. The dependent variable is the number of times the individual elite was appointed in a given year. The independent variable is their affiliation, whether they belong to the party, the government, the military, or outside organization, and also variables after the 7th Party Congress in 2016. And there were also control variables like GDP per capita, the economic growth rate, age, because that could be related to the compensation that I talked about earlier. So you probably can't see the letters because they're very small, so I'll explain. Now, military variables increase the probability of appointment, is what it says here, whereas the government variable decreases the probability of appointment. And if I were to make an analysis by group, probability of appointment is significantly higher for party and military elites whose group solidarity is high than the government and outer organization elite whose solidarity is low. And even so, that was the outcome. And even with the control variable considered, we still got the same outcome. So how can we interpret this then? It means that compared to government elites, military elites are about 95% and party elites are about 82% more likely to be appointed. So when we flip that around, the government elites are the ones at the biggest advantage in terms of their appointment in the Kim Jong-un era. Now this is the next table related to my findings, but what changed after 2016? What's interesting here is the probability of military elites being appointed changed dramatically after 2016. So whereas the military elites were appointed to key posts before 2016, that was not the case after 2016. So how should we go about interpreting this? So once again, the military elites were less likely to be appointed to key posts after 2016, whereas
제가 개인적으로 생각했을 때는 김정은 체제에서는
there was no significant difference in terms of the party elite. So we could say that the Kim Jong-un era or the Kim Jong-un regime regards the party as an important platform in concretizing his power. So the conclusion is that even in North Korea with a strong dictatorship, there can be some tensions and conflicts within the key elite group. And the conclusion is also that the elite group is not always obedient and passive to the supreme leader, but they have dynamics of their own, and they do experience conflict with the leader. This research findings actually supports the claims of some scholars of existing researches that the Kim Jong-un regime was reorganized from a military-centered to a party-centered power structure. People talked about a lot about this back in 2011 and 2012 in the early days of Kim Jong-un regime. But the findings of this research tells us that the power structure of the North Korea actually changed significantly since 2016, and we have evidences backing this. So to summarize once again, the change in power structure in North Korea did not take place immediately after Kim Jong-un's succession of power, but began in earnest in 2016 after Kim Jong-un concretized his power.
그래서 이 연구는 북한 내부 정치에 대한 그 경험적인 증거에 기반한 연구들이 별로 없었는데
Because there were not many researches on North Korea based on empirical data, I believe that this research can make a significant contribution in this area. And also, going forward, perhaps we can conduct in the future researches based on empirical data about the punishment structure of North Korea, the demotion and the purge of the elites. This would further help the scholars and the academics pursue their related studies. Thank you very much. We will now move into discussions. Now let me introduce Professor Kim In-woo. He is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science and Diplomacy at Seongkyungwan University, but he has to go to class right after he gives his remarks. He only has 5 minutes to spare because he has class. So I will hand the floor over to him now.
Hello, I am Kim In-wook from Seongkyungwan University. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So what Professor Kim mentioned is that he has applied the philosophy of Hegel in understanding better Kim Jong-un's regime, and that was quite interesting. And it was also very useful in leveraging I was very much stunned that we were able to use the philosophy of the German philosopher to North Korean issues. That's a question that is subject to discussion, but there are also the framework analysis framework, and also the methodologies that were presented in his presentation. I sometimes found those a little bit repetitive, but that is also open to discussion. But it was quite new and very fresh to learn about how Hegel's philosophy was applied for the better understanding the current issue, and I hope that you will further develop your researches going forward. I would like to focus my remarks on 4 points. So first is regarding recognition and acknowledgement. So what is the level of acknowledgement that we need? So if you look at his paper, the political entity that is not recognized or acknowledged will be ostracized and isolated, and the members will be under more pressure. So he actually mentioned the importance of being recognized. But if we apply this principle to North Korea wants to ensure its survival and to function well as a regime. But you can say sometimes that the level of recognition that is required for North Korea may not be as high as you think. For example, North Korea may not want to be or may not need to be recognized by the whole entire international community, because during the Cold Era, there were some countries that did survive and yet didn't get recognition from the entire international community. And we're seeing an intensifying U.S.-China conflicts and also Russia's invasion of Ukraine and weaker leadership of the U.S., and we are seeing signs regarding this. And there are also questions as to whether U.S. can continue to lead the world order. So in this situation, the free liberal movements or democratic movements that were led by United States were indeed a prevalent trend. But if, like China and India and other countries, form a coalition and that becomes stronger, North Korea could join that coalition, and North Korea may feel recognized by the international community by joining that kind of coalition. And that level of recognition or acknowledgement could be enough for North Korea. And that's how it may think. And internally in North Korea, and sometimes the link between the difficulties in and out of North Korea is not that strong like in democratic countries. And there are lots of control mechanisms that are in play in North Korea. So given all of these situations, we have to really think about what would be the sufficient level of recognition required or wanted by North Korea. And that level of recognition, acknowledgement can be interpreted very differently by different actors. We could see I wanted to know how we can actually address that question based on Hegel's text or Professor Kim's research. And second is nuclear development. Even though we have the assumption that it was based on the assumption that North Korea wants to be recognized by the international community, but contrary to these intentions, we can say that North Korea developed the nuclear weapons, and that actually resulted in the ostracization and isolation of North Korea within the international community. So the desire to be recognized, does that have a great impact on North Korea, is an important question to ask. And another example to share with you is when it comes to Israel, Pakistan, and India, even though they developed nuclear weapons on the outskirts or outside of the NPT regime, they hold their status as a nuclear power, and yet they have no problem in taking part in the initiatives of the international community. And maybe that is the direction that North Korea wants to take. So it is a double sides of the coin. And if North Korea continues to be a nuclear country, how do you believe that North Korea would want to be recognized, and what should be the conditions that need to be met in terms of determining the level of recognition of North Korea? And also, I want to talk a little bit about methodology. So, Professor Kim mentioned about
but there are articles criticizing the U.S. and they can be interpreted in many ways. There are crises occurring between the U.S. and North Korea. They could become more frequent, and based on the traditional security theory, of course, North Korea can feel most threatened by the United States and put out critical rhetorics. So going beyond just the figures and the statistics, I know that this would require extensive research efforts, but maybe we should analyze the texts as well. What specific words or phrases were used, for example. And this would, maybe these rhetorics can, after analysis, show that the rhetorics are indeed being made not to threaten or criticize the United States, but they're actually targeted towards gaining recognition from the United States. So maybe a text analysis would be great. And lastly, I'd like to talk about the solutions. You talked about how we should be careful of hubris and how intersubjectivity is very important. And I believe that's very important as well. But on the other hand, you were very realistic. Now we must take another step forward so as to make some progress. Now, to be recognized, let's say that North Korea is being obsessed with a nuclear program, then does that mean that we need to also recognize North Korea's program as part of the regime? That's a question that I have in mind. And maybe we can link that to the existing solutions, and with the concept of recognition in mind, we can analyze the existing solutions like disarmament or arms control. So perhaps we could recognize North Korea's nuclear program, but approach it in a way that would allow us to maintain stability and maintain the security situation in the region. Or we could say that maybe we cannot make concessions in this area, but because we know that North Korea wants to be recognized, then what are some alternatives that we can offer to them? Not just economic assistance, but we have to approach with that viewpoint of North Korea wanting to be recognized in mind, and perhaps we could come up with some fresh solutions that are more effective. Thank you very much, Professor, for your wonderful comments. Now I would like to introduce the next discussants.
박사님이신데요.
Professor Jeon Bong-gun is from the Korea National Diplomacy Academy, and he is a North Korean nuclear issue expert. He's one of the most renowned experts and scholar here in Korea. Another discussant is Mr. Peter Ward. You probably know him already. He is a columnist for NK Pro. And he is a PhD candidate at the University of Vienna at this moment. So we do not have much time. So I would like to ask the both of you to make your remarks for 5 minutes, because I want to give the remaining time to the presenters to be able to reply to your comments. So I'm sorry, but can you make your remarks 5 minutes?
네, 오늘 이 자리에서 토론할 기회를 갖게 되어서.
So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be a discussant of this session.
세 분의 발제를 저는 한 글에 대해서 김학재 박사님의 글만 토론할 텐데요.
I'm only going to talk about Professor Kim Hak-jae's presentation.
받은 인상이
So the impression I got was that the approach of new generational scholars is a little bit different from old generation scholars like me.
아마 탄핵적인 북한 핵 문제가 지금 거의 30년의 역사를 가지고 있습니다.
So the nuclear issue of North Korea has lasted for the past 30 years. I was fortunate to be involved with this issue for the past 25 years, and I believe that I am from the older generation, so from the post-Cold War perspective, I studied this issue from an older generation scholar's perspective. And my perspective or approach was very much focused on also finding solutions for denuclearization. But when I listen to all these presentations, a lot of the scholars take the current situation of North Korea as a current status or as a phenomenon. And while doing that, we can also come up with a lot of policy recommendations. But it seems like a lot of our younger scholars very much focused on taking stock of the current situation. And I believe that there are some additional elements that we can bring. For example, we consider North denuclearization as something that is very natural, and that is why we focused on this issue for a long time. But I think we have failed many times over the years. And 30 years ago, when we first initiated the negotiation, it was at a time when North Korea had only, for example, one nuclear weapon. But a lot of experts estimate that North Korea has at least 50, or it has the nuclear materials to make 50 nuclear weapons. And every year, it adds about 5 nuclear weapons. So by 2030, North Korea is expected to have about 100 nuclear weapons. So if that happens, then it will be on par with Israel and Pakistan. So if that is the case, then I think that we have to take an approach that is a little bit different. Of course, the approaches that we have taken over the years have failed, but I would like to ask also the younger generations if you are to make an objective stock of the current situation of North Korea, and then that would also be very crucial in developing more specific denuclearization strategies as well. So let me share with you some points. So while I'm raising this question, so the conditions for achieving denuclearization conditions or initiating these negotiations. So Professor Kim mentioned about the three pillars in beginning the negotiation for denuclearization. And I do agree with these three pillars. For the past 30 years, there was one hypothesis that I came up with. There is a vicious cycle hypothesis of North Korean negotiations. For example, when there is a North crisis, then the negotiation starts, and when nuclear agreement is reached, then it eventually is broken. And we have gone through this 7 rounds of vicious cycle, and the evidence proves that. So as Professor Kim said, now we are at the stage to initiate the denuclearization negotiation, and we need the conditions that need to be met, and we have to come up with an agreement. So the background of this vicious cycle assumption of mine is that I wanted to, because I was very much interested in breaking that vicious cycle. So Professor Kim actually here mentions about the conditions for the sustainability of the negotiations. We really have to focus on the durability and sustainability of negotiations. A lot of the efforts were geared towards resuming the talks with North Korea. But I believe that all the interested parties, so both Korea's and the U.S., need to have an agreement that everybody can agree on. If we don't have that agreement, then agreement will be broken. And even though North Korea temporarily signs this agreement, it is highly likely that this agreement will end up in vain. So if we want to sustain negotiation and sustain agreements to be implemented, then these interests need to be sustained as well. So when the crisis is incumbent, I think that the interests are aligned at the point that we want to put an end to this crisis, and that is why we come up with a very incomplete agreement. And when we try to sell this agreement after coming back to Korea and to the people, it's very difficult. It's difficult for South Korea, North Korea, and also the U.S. So if we are to reach an agreement, we need to have a political alignment. Of course, we have a political alignment when signing agreements, but these political alignments do not last long. And Dr. Kim mentioned about the importance of sustainability, and I think that we have to heed to this word. Last point I would like to make is there was a quote of Syrian Sion in his presentation, and Scott Sagan 10 years ago said why states build nuclear weapons in his article in International Security magazine. And that article was about the motivations behind the countries becoming nuclear. And I often quote this article in my paper, so I would like to also ask the presenter to also have a look into that article. So I think my time is almost up, but I would like to end up with one question. I think that nuclear agreement So when it comes to nuclear agreement, we have to think about why North Korea is very keen on becoming nuclearized, much more than other countries. I think that is due to the divided structure of both Koreas. There is Pakistan and India and other nuclear countries, and our divided structure of the Korean Peninsula compared to these countries are based on the zero-sum competition or minus-sum competition. So we have to take that into consideration. So we are now entering into a new Cold War, confrontation between the two Koreas and U.S.-China confrontations. We have to normalize all of these relations, and the issue of divided Korea should also be considered as a very peculiar point when in addressing the North Korean nuclear issue. So if you have any questions, please ask questions online for our online participants, and for our offline participants, I would like to turn it to the floor for questions or comments later on. Now, Mr. Peter Ward.
Thank you very much. Now, under patronage or under guardianship, the military and the party, or the military and the party elites were the ones who had more power when Kim Jong-un had power. But do you mean that that the elite appointment changed after 2016 because Kim Jong-un was able to gain more power? Then if so, why would we appoint elites with whose affiliation have low cohesion to key positions? Because if their group in which they belong have low cohesion or low solidarity, it means that they are less capable, that they have less power. If you actually appoint elites who have strong cohesiveness, you might be able to actually enhance the nation's power. So I just want to raise a question with regards to your research, because I have some opposing ideas. And you said that the party has high level of cohesiveness. Yes, I agree. And many people would agree. However, there is the Politburo within the military, and there is the Ministry of State Security, and other instruments in place that can prevent a potential coup. So why would Kim Jong-un be so worried of these military elites when there is a low chance of coup? And do you really think the elite in the government and outer organizations really have a low level of solidarity? Because people in the cabinet have similar years of career, similar thinking, and they have similar interests. So even though they have low, I think maybe it'd be difficult for us to say that the government elites have a low level of cohesiveness. Then, what could be the middle ground? Now, after 2016, after concretizing his power, Kim Jong-un now has the authority to appoint whoever he wants to key positions. But what kind of implication does that have for his policies that he pursued after 2016? And how are we to understand the political decisions made by Kim Jong-un after 2016, given that change in the structure with regards to elite appointment? Can you answer those questions? Yes, thank you very much for your comments. We don't have any questions online, but if you have any questions from the floor, please feel free to speak.
아마 시간 관계상으로 발표하신 분들의 답변을 듣고 싶으신 것 같은데 혹시 질문 있으실까요?
So does anyone have any questions? If not,
시간을 이제 발표하실 분들께 좀
I would like to give
질문하실 내용들
a chance to the presenters to address the questions that were raised to them.
발표를 들어보시겠지만 김지훈 박사님은
So Dr. Kim Ji-hoon
사상가들의 통찰력에서 현재
referred to the insights of past philosophers to look at North Korea today, and Professor Kim Hak-jae
이 환경들을 좀 브로드하게 보면서
broadly took a look at the surrounding environment
찾지 않을까.
and tried to find insights.
하나의 리스크와 동시에 또 하나의
There is both
희망을 말씀하십니다.
a risk and hope in his message. The risk is that
고도화 쭉 가면
if we pursue conventional weapons, whereas the US keeps on developing nuclear weapons,
전술핵 쪽을 쓰게
then North Korea might resort to, there is a risk of North Korea resorting to tactical nuclear weapons. But the hope is that with North Korea regime facing instability due to sanctions, but if external circumstances become stabilized, then there would be some room for North Korea to come to negotiation table. And Dr. Kim Taek-bin analyzed data, and I have a question too. Why 2016?
시기와 겹치는 문제인가?
Is it because it overlaps with the time when North Korea conducted a sixth nuclear test, or is it because the Pyeongjin policy or the dual track policy
혹은 장승택 체험과 관계된 것인가?
began in earnest, or is it related to the execution of Kim Jong-un's uncle Jang Song-taek? Why 2016? If you can explain, I would appreciate it, but the problem is
질문들을 다 답변하시기에 시간이 부족하니까
you don't have enough time to address all the questions,
셀렉트해서
so I will select
선별해서 답변하시도록
the presenter to answer the question.
3분 정도.
I will give you 3 minutes. I'm sorry, I will allocate the time for you to answer these questions, so you have 3 minutes.
여러 가지 말씀해 주셨는데
So Professor Kim Il-ho made various remarks,
오늘 정리한 내용 더
and hopefully we'll be able to engage in further discussions at a later chance. But
저는 크게 두 가지로 정리할 수 있을 것 같아요.
I think I can organize your comments largely into 2 parts. First,
실질적으로 인정을 바라고 있는 상태냐?
does North Korea really want to be recognized?
북한이 그러한
And
인정을
two,
통해서 원하는 바가
What does North Korea want through that recognition? After gaining that recognition, what does North Korea want to do?
첫 번째 코멘트로 전 기억을 하고 있는데요.
So,
커뮤니티 블록이 형성이 된다고 하면 대외적으로
if there is a communist
북한이 인정을
bloc
원하는 바가
formed,
미국이 아니더라도 가능하지 않겠느냐.
that recognition
어떤 이득을 취하는
may come
것이나
from not
그렇지
just the
않을까.
US but other countries, and North Korea might be satisfied with that.
저의 입장으로는
And I think that's what you said, but I'm a bit skeptical about that comment. So we have the US-China conflict, the Ukraine-Russia war.
탈냉전이라고 하는 시대를 지내왔었지만
We have gone past the post-Cold War era, but that bloc still has not been eradicated completely. The actors of the communist bloc are in a consistent clash with the Western countries in order to fulfill their own interests. If that bloc becomes more solidified, North Korea, who belongs to that bloc, will still want to be recognized by the Western countries, especially the United States. And you're right, maybe a text analysis would be able to better show that. And secondly, given North Korea's unique characteristics, does the North Korean regime and its leader really need support from the people? And I think the answer can vary. If the sanctions are limited, and if North Korea can indeed, through secret channels, circumvent the sanctions and is able to maintain its economy, that means that people's livelihood will not face that of a hardship as we may believe, which means that the support from the people might not be so urgent for North Korea. If we can actually trust, however, the statistics from the international community, and if the sanctions are prolonged, then I think internally there will still be that desire for international recognition or U.S. recognition. Then second question is, what does North Korea want to gain from that recognition?
김일희 교수님 코멘트해 주신 대로 당연히 이게 핵무기에 대한 인정은 아닐 겁니다.
Of course, this is not a recognition of its nuclear program.
이 핵무기 핵 전략을 포기하라고 하는 우리의 발언이 상당히 무용해지는 결과이기 때문에
This was actually
무엇이 될 수 있느냐는 조금 더 고민해 보아야
put our argument to denuclearize North Korea futile, but
얼마만큼 북한이 실질적으로 요구하고 있는 바, 실질적으로 원하고 있는
what
바가
does North Korea really want
고민해 왔느냐를 저는 질문을 했었고 저도 이 부분에
is what we ought to be concerned about, and that's what
남겨두는 쪽으로
we, not just myself, but us as a whole should think about. I think this should be left as a future task for us to pursue.
봉근 선생님께서 사실은 이 비핵화와 관련해서 굉장히 오랫동안 연구해 오신 선생님이신데 이렇게 토론해 주셔서 너무 감사드리고요. 어떤 그 비핵화 관련된 이번 학회에도 굉장히 많은 논의가 있었겠지만
I'd like to thank you for sharing your comments, Professor Chan, as a long-time expert of this issue. And actually, in the National Library, there are about 4,000 papers that you can find about denuclearization. So this is to say that lots of recommendations have been made regarding this topic, but we have not seen substantial outcome in terms of denuclearization. So this makes us to think that efforts are indeed necessary, but we really have to have a good understanding of the current situation so that we can come up with a more sustained approach.
예전에
Andrew J. Ko,
조지 워싱턴 대학 학자인 것으로
professor at George Washington University, he once said that
협상을 다 분석을 했더니
he actually analyzed all the historical non-proliferation negotiations, and he said that the successful denuclearization or non-proliferations negotiations or agreements happened at the initial phase of negotiation.
많은 분들이
So,
비관적으로 얘기하시기 때문에
since a lot of people are a little bit pessimistic here today, I just wanted to present what are the conditions that need to be met for us to initiate negotiations. And I wanted to also share with you some opportunities that we can explore together, even though the current situation is harsh. And as our moderator said in his introduction, regarding globalization and post-Cold War. In the past, we had a lot of positive thoughts on these topics. But there is an increasing risk and increasing burden, and if that happens, there are at least minimum efforts that are made to reverse the situation. And there could be a time when we bottom out from the situation or the crisis. A lot of international efforts are being mobilized. But I think that the imbalance of deterrence between the two Koreas and U.S., that could continue. But we also have to think about the relationship between Russia, U.S., and U.S. China. So against this backdrop, since North Korea believes, or if North Korea believes that its regime is unstable right now, then maybe we can all work together to try to initiate denuclearization negotiations. And in the past, when we placed focus on inter-Korean relations, Korea-Japan relations worsened, and vice versa. So Now, we are witnessing a very solid ROK-US alliance. So in that situation, I think that we can go for a different pattern of negotiation with North Korea. Thank you very much.
네, 먼저 피터와드 조금
Yes.
피터와드랑 개인적으로도 친분이 있어서
Thank you, Mr. Word, for your comment. And I actually are friends with him, so we exchange personal messages over the phone with regards to this, my research paper. So I'll answer him in more detail later on. But to address his questions, yes, there are many competent elites inside the military, so he doesn't understand why they're not being appointed to key posts. Yes, that is true for the military elites, but that's not the case for party elites, meaning that the probability or the possibility or the chances of party elites being appointed to key posts is increasing. I think that's what I want to emphasize. And Professor Kim asked me, why 2016? Now, in 2016, in May, the 7th Party Congress was held. And many of the elites who were appointed back in 2010 were replaced. And those elites were replaced by Kim Jong-un's will, I believe. And that actually reflects the trend of the times. I think that's as far as I can answer right now because of the time limitation. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we have always thought about North Korean issue as a single equation. In the past, we tried to resolve North Korea's nuclear issue based on inter-Korean relations and based on our ethnic homogeneity and so on. But as Professor Chun said, I think we can basically say that the past approaches have failed. In other words, a single equation approach has failed. I think we can make that conclusion today. To the three presentations today tell us that we should not resort to this single equation approach, but actually look towards multiple equations when looking at North Korea. We would have to look inside the North Korean regime and look at our past insights and future insights and closely explore the situation that we are in and North Korea is in from various perspectives in multifaceted ways so as to gain fresh new insights into North Korea. Thank you very much for the valuable presentations and your insightful comments. I would like to thank all the attendees here at the venue and also online. And that concludes today's session. Thank you very much. That concludes the last session for today. Tomorrow's first session will be held from 10:30. We ask for your attendance and interest. Thank you so much once again for taking part in session 6-1.